Our sonar watch was reinforced, but they picked up no further trace of the submarine. My uneasiness continued, however, until 01 when our convoy reached the landing point. The landing started at 0120 on February 1st, with no pre-invasion bombardment from our warships. That was not in accordance with the original schedule. After my encounter with the sub, the enemy must have been fully alerted, and I was itching for a chance to bombard. I thought it meaningless to attempt an invasion against alerted enemy forces, with no pre-landing bombardment. Nevertheless, no bombardment orders came from the flagship. Admiral Tanaka explained to me after the war that he had omitted bombardment, figuring that the ground opposition, even though alerted, would be weak. An even more binding reason, he explained, was that he had orders to conserve ammunition as much as practicable. That may sound ridiculous to Americans, but it was a grim reality to Japan. In the prosecution of that stupendous war, we were constantly reminded of the need for conserving. At the same time, we were experiencing American saturation bombings and massive pre-landing bombardments that were incomprehensible to us. Navy gunners were trained constantly to hit the target with opening salvos. Range-finding salvos, as used by Americans, were completely out of the question for us. That was an additional reason for my displeasure at the poor marksmanship of my gunners in shooting at the enemy submarine. The landing troops, as I had anticipated, were stopped at the beach by enemy ground fire. Commander Konosuke Ayaki, in charge of the invasion troops, signaled at 02, "We are pinned down and the landing is thwarted." But he would not ask for support bombardment. On the bridge of Amatsukaze I squirmed with vexation. The situation was disgusting in every respect. At 0320 the landing troops finally signaled that the beachhead was secured. But there was more trouble ahead. At 05 they radioed, "Enemy fortress guns cover our flanks." Word came at noon by radio that Commander Ayaki had been killed in action. It was ridiculous. Why did he have to die like that? A preliminary bombardment and continued shipboard fire support would have spared his life and many others. Stupid, stupid. That sad news was followed shortly by orders from Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka. All escort vessels close beach to pick up casualties. Amatsukaze loaded 30 dead and 90 wounded. Meanwhile the ground fighting was stalemated. We could not shoot now because of the confined ground situation. Japanese float planes from tender chateaus finally appeared early the following day and attacked the enemy's fortified positions. Still there were no fighters or bombers from carriers Hiryu or Soryu. I simply could not understand why aerial cooperation was so inadequate. The seaplanes, coming in 6 at a time, were manned by brilliant flyers. They attacked enemy gun positions with telling effect. At one time they tangled with 5 enemy bombers, apparently from the Dutch East Indies, and shot down 2 of them. No Japanese planes were lost. The Dutch-Australian garrison surrendered in the first evening of the invasion, February 1, 1942. 200 garrison troops were taken prisoner. They told us that some 70 mines were laid at the main harbor on the southern side of Ambon Island. Our minesweepers spent a week on the hair-raising job of sweeping the narrow harbor. 3 of them were hit by mines and sank with their crews. 2 days after the surrender, a transport moored near the mouth of the mine-filled harbor signaled, "Ship under torpedo attack from seaward." And indeed it was. Fortunately none of the torpedoes found targets, but the alert sent me into action immediately. I figured that these torpedoes must have come from the very same submarine that had fooled me 3 days earlier. I was grimly determined to find and sink it. For 5 hours sleek Amatsukaze chugged about at a snail like 11 knots. Our insensitive sonar gear would not function effectively if the ship moved any faster. An aggressive submarine could make an easy mark of such a slow target, even though it was a destroyer armed with deadly anti-submarine weapons. I thought of destroyer Sagiri sunk by a submarine torpedo near Borneo in December. When a destroyer is patrolling, concentrating on spotting an enemy, it is fully on guard. If any sub was attracted by Amatsukaze, snailing at this tempting speed, I felt ready for it. But we picked up no trace of the submarine. As the slow hours stretched into 5, the situation developed into a war of nerves. At 21:34 a sonarman shouted exultantly, "Submarine, distant 2,400 meters, bearing 10 degrees to port." I ordered, "Everybody to combat station, prepare depth charges. 8 charges. Set for depth of 50 meters. The sonar officer chanted in a calm professional voice. Sub at 1,800 meters, 40 degrees to port. The sub now at 1,300 meters, 50 degrees to the left. It seems to be swerving to the left. Amatsukaze's course was adjusted to the new bearings. At 21:53 the sonar officer shrieked in dismay, lost track of sub. Strangely calm at this news, I immediately judged that the sub had slipped into a blind angle. It and Amatsukaze must be cruising on an identical course. Japanese sonar in those early days operated on the principle of sending out sound waves and calculating an object's distance by checking the rebounding waves. These devices were not sensitive enough to pick up a sub's engine noises directly. My head was filled with calculations of bearings, angles, and distance. The answer came almost reflexively. The sub is 180 degrees, or dead ahead. Moving at 9 knots, now 1,000 meters away, at a depth of about 30 meters. I ordered speed boosted to 21 knots, and looked at the second hand of my watch. I rapidly diagrammed the two ships' navigation curves. At 2,158 we released 8 depth charges when I believed the enemy sub was directly below. I put Amatsukaze about and turned back, poised for another series of a depth charge attack. The surface of the sea gave off a strong odor of diesel oil in the dark night. We could see nothing. The smell of oil grew stronger. We were well aware of skunk tactics used by submarines under attack. By releasing oil while submerged they try to induce pursuers to believe they have been sunk. We searched the site diligently for 2 hours, but picked up no trace of our quarry. I wrote the sub off as sunk, but there was no exultation in me. 4 days passed and there were no other reports of the sub. It was obvious that I had scored a kill. I realized grimly that there is little real cause for elation in warfare. I learned a great deal from the Ambon operation. On the 9th of February, I returned to Davao, in escort of the transport Kirishima Maru, and carrying some of the wounded and dead who had fallen at Ambon. The voyage was uneventful. Peace and quiet was restored completely in Davao. Hostilities in the Philippines were now limited to Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. Other scenes of war had moved far to the south. Davao had not seen an enemy plane in more than a month. Huge bundles of letters from home awaited us. There were also many packages and comfort kits sent by relatives and other friendly civilians in the homeland. On arriving at Davao I enjoyed a long, leisurely bath, for the first time in 20 days. When a Japanese destroyer was on combat assignment, even its skipper willingly skipped the luxury of a bath. I relaxed in my small cabin, after ordering my crew to bathe and take it easy. The ship's store was ordered opened. It carried liquors, candy and toilet goods. Men were allowed to buy and drink liquor on board with the sanction of their skipper. Small as my cabin was, it was still the best quarters in the narrow ship. The 6 by 9 foot space was filled with a bed, toilet equipment, a small round table, a wardrobe, and a sofa and stool. On the table was a photograph of my family. Murata, a young sailor, delivered my mail, which included packages and letters. "Did you receive your mail, Murata?" "Yes, sir, I did." He beamed, saluted and turned around. I opened a letter from my wife dated January 4th. She reported that the 3 children and herself were well and happy. A postscript, however, reported disturbing news. The day before yesterday, I took the children to Tokyo for a visit with relatives. Our maid was away, and when I returned to Kamakura the door lock was broken and all our valuables were gone. That was distressing. My wife was from a good family and was totally unused to this kind of thing. In my anxiety about this I downed several cups of sake. There was a package from my eldest brother, who lived in Osaka. It contained a waistband with 1,000 stitches, handmade with crimson thread. A traditional Japanese charm against enemy bullets. My brother's wife wrote that she had stood at a downtown street corner to solicit 999 other women to contribute a stitch each to it. Gratefully I put it about my waist, although I held no belief in the superstition. A letter from my brother contained further distressing news. His eldest son, Shigeyoshi Hashimoto, 25, a machine gun officer in the 4th Army Division, had died in December of tuberculosis. This nephew had been my favorite. I closed my eyes and mumbled a prayer for him. Feeling depressed, I stopped opening the mail, had a few more drinks, and walked out onto the bridge. It was a lovely day. The harbor looked beautiful under the bright tropical sun. The duty officer sat gazing wistfully at the shore as I approached. He stood up and saluted. "Announce that I am authorizing shore leave tomorrow for all hands. They will be organized into 3 groups and each will have 3 hours of liberty." The lieutenant's eyes lit up with excitement and he immediately started to spread the good word. Not one man in my crew of 300 had been ashore during the past 50 days, so the announcement was received with great joy. I returned to the cabin and opened another letter. It was from Kerr, but the sender's name on the back of the envelope was unknown to me. The letter read, "I am Hinagaku, one of the geisha girls, who served in the party before your departure to the war." I groaned. I, the father of 3 children, certainly had not anticipated a love letter from a geisha girl. The letter was filled with prosaic good wishes which ended on a decidedly sour note. "The landlady of the restaurant has reminded me that you forgot to settle the account before your sudden departure. We should be happy if you will pay the attached bill at your convenience." This certainly put me to shame. I was disgusted to realize that at my age I could be so shiftless. I had a sudden desire to get drunk, and downed another bottle of sake. The last package was from Hiroshima and I knew by the childish handwriting of its sender that it was a comfort kit. Japanese school children made these little gift packages on their own and sent them with a note to some unknown serviceman at the front. My package yielded a set of picture postcards showing the famed Hiroshima landscape, a sketch by the sender, a bunch of envelopes, and a letter pad. An accompanying note read, "I am a 9-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima. All the school children here are studying hard. We sincerely pray you will fight hard for the sake of our nation." This was the only really heartening letter of the day. I stopped drinking, and began writing replies, first to the unknown Hiroshima girl, "My dear young lady, thank you very much for your very kind comfort kit. I am the commanding officer of a destroyer. I am grateful and happy to receive your sincere good wishes." The following day I went ashore with the first of my crew headed for their 3-hour liberty. It was good to see that the streets of Davao had not been damaged. They were crowded with crews from other warships anchored in the harbor. Housewives of Japanese residents in the city had set up refreshment stands with signs reading, "Please help yourself to coffee and tea. Served free by your fellow countrymen." Filipinos were also walking the streets peacefully. The girls with their elaborate hairdos and bright ribbons and the men with brilliantly pomaded hair presented a gay picture. It was surprising for me to note, however, that most of them were barefoot. In Japan, no one walks barefoot on a city street. Anyone who can afford it owns a pair of shoes. Those who cannot, wear wooden clogs. I was intrigued by the native scene. Theaters were showing the latest American movies to packed audiences. On side streets I noticed a number of houses marked, "Japanese Military Recreation Center." Many sailors and soldiers were queuing up in front of them. These were brothels whose Japanese, Korean and Okinawan occupants followed wherever the Japanese military moved. I noted a sudden uneasiness among the men, obviously because of my presence. I said to my lieutenant, "Let's part here. I must go to headquarters. I will meet you at noon. Caution your chiefs to count noses at the pier." Aye, sir," grinned the lieutenant. As we parted, the men shouted gaily, "Bravo, long live our skipper." On February 27–28, 1942, I took part in the Battle of Java Sea. That action is worthy of note as one of the few major sea battles of World War II in which no planes were involved except for reconnaissance. Accordingly, it deserves a full description and analysis. There have been many books by both Allied and Japanese authors which purport to tell the story of this action. Most of the Allied books were written too soon after the war. The author's feelings seem still to have been running too high to permit objectivity and historical detachment. Nor do the Japanese books thus far impress me as being either objective or accurate. Part of this shortcoming is attributable to a lack of source documents, to be sure, but defeated and dispirited commanders are really not capable of giving objective accounts of their battles. Most of the commanding officers of the Allied ships in this battle were killed during the action. Therefore it is not possible to reconstruct all the details of the Allied side. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, the top Japanese commander in the battle, was killed at Saipan in 1944. He was survived by his chief of staff, Captain Ko Nagasawa, now a top-ranking admiral of the new Japanese Navy, and Nagasawa's assistant, Lieutenant Commander Kotaro Ishikawa, who was Takagi's intelligence officer. Before writing this chapter, I had long discussions with each of them as well as other surviving officers involved in the battle. The Allied fleet made first contact with the Japanese convoy off Surabaya and reached out in an effort to destroy it. At the outset, the Allied column of 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers managed to box the 41 slow transports of the convoy as well as its escort of 10 destroyers and 2 light cruisers. The transports were loaded with a division of Army troops. There were also 2 Japanese heavy cruisers assigned to this operation, but they lagged some 150 miles behind the convoy. With all their initial advantage of position and numerical superiority, the Allies failed to sink a single Japanese vessel in this encounter. Though the many errors committed by both sides seemed to offset each other, the really decisive factor, in my opinion, was morale. It is interesting to compare this battle with what took place at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. There the Japanese fleet, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, played an almost identical role to that of Dutch Rear Admiral K. W.F. M. Doorman's forces in the Java Sea Battle. At Leyte Gulf, Kurita cornered 4 of the enemy's light carriers, slow and vulnerable, and could have dealt them a shattering blow. But he turned around at the critical moment and gave up a brilliant chance. That was exactly what the Allied fleet did in the Java Sea. Kurita went to Leyte with grim determination, but with full realization that he had no chance of winning against the overwhelming forces of the enemy. It is important to note that psychological background before criticizing his seemingly foolish reversal. In February 1942, a sense of hopelessness reigned among Allied officers at Surabaya. They saw little or no chance of survival. The Allied fleet of 15 fighting ships was licking its wounds. All these ships knew that they were likely to face a real showdown within a week. Allied commanders recalled the Pearl Harbor attack and the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse 2 months earlier. They had almost refused to accept the news at first, and there was still disbelief in their minds. But facts piled on facts. Singapore had just fallen. Complete occupation of the Philippines appeared imminent. The Japanese were surging to the south, reducing one outpost after another. The Imperial Navy's mighty task force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was known to be moving in the waters of the South Pacific. It appeared to enemy eyes as a mammoth super armada. They simply had no way of knowing just how huge it was, or how many carriers Japan had. This confusion sprang in part from the fact that the enemy could not tell whether attacking Japanese planes came from carriers or land bases. The massive air raids on the Philippines, carried out a few hours after Pearl Harbor, were believed to have come from Japanese carriers. Actually, the planes came from Formosa. A series of bomber attacks over Java were also carried out by land-based Japanese planes from Jolo, Balikpapan and Kendari. To Allied officers at Surabaya, these planes appeared to have come from Japanese carriers in the Java Sea. On February 1, a small American task force attacked the Marshall Islands. Nagumo's task force promptly rushed out from Truk on a 1,500-mile sortie to the Marshalls. Allies at Surabaya, hearing of this movement, thought it was now safe to go out and attack the Japanese. Their 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers steamed to Balikpapan, hoping to repeat the achievements of Commander Paul Talbot. The Japanese were not napping this time. 60 Japanese bombers and fighters which had come from Formosa to Kendari, swooped down on February 4 and damaged the Allied fleet. These ships limped back to Surabaya, stunned by what they believed to have been carrier-borne Japanese planes. The whole affair was a nightmare to them. On the 19th, another event impossible in the eyes of the Surabaya headquarters occurred right over their heads. Allied intelligence reports said the Nagamo task force had turned before reaching the Marshalls and was headed toward Australia. Early that morning, Nagumo hurled 188 bombers and fighters in a devastating raid on Port Darwin. About noon the same day, 23 Zero fighters swarmed over Surabaya and shot down 40 Allied fighters, mostly P-36s, in a brief air melee. Even if the intelligence man at Balikpapan had reported accurately that these Japanese Navy fighters had flown 450 miles from Formosan bases, the Allied officers would probably not have believed it. They were all convinced that the Zeros were from carriers. Later that same day, a group of Japanese bombers from Kendari struck a secret enemy airfield at Jombang, near Surabaya, and destroyed P-40s, Buffaloes, and British Hurricanes based there. Japanese combat planes were fast gaining respect in the eyes of the enemy. It was no chance thing that Britain's proudest battleship had fallen victim to their attack. The same fate could meet any of the remaining ships at Surabaya. Against this background, the commanding officers at Surabaya on February 20 mulled over the latest reports that two massive Japanese convoys were heading toward Java. One convoy of 41 transports with some 20 escorting warships left Jolo for Surabaya on February 19. The other, with 56 transports and 15 escorts, had left Cameron Bay, Indochina, 2 days earlier heading for Western Java. The high command at Surabaya must have been in agony. If the Allied fleet went out to tackle one of the Japanese convoys, it might win a battle. But it would not then have a chance of defeating the second convoy. The most difficult factor for the enemy, however, must have been the unpredictability of Nagumo's mighty task force. It might turn up at any moment to swing its sledgehammer blows at the Allied fleet, now devoid of air cover. Meanwhile, Japanese planes were able to come and go at will. At the Japanese High Command, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Combined Fleet, had met with his staff officers on February 17 aboard battleship Nagato, moored at Hashirajima near Kure in central Japan. He had already ordered Nagumo to turn around and hit Port Darwin without pursuing the small American task force. "We must secure oil and other resources of the Dutch East Indies. That is of higher priority than pursuing any small American force." Yamamoto doubtless had in mind the outline of his forthcoming Midway operation. When his staff had studied all intelligence data and reported to him, Yamamoto concluded that the Allied surface fleet in Surabaya was no potential threat to Japanese actions. And he ordered the two convoys, each carrying an army division, to weigh anchor. The landing operation does not require the support of a major task force, Yamamoto ruled. So Nagumo pushed 220 miles north of Port Darwin on February 19. On February 20 Yamamoto held another staff meeting. It was decided that the Allied fleet was completely demoralized and no longer in shape to attempt any major action. Yamamoto cancelled his earlier plan of using land-based planes as air cover for the Japanese convoys. Nagumo was ordered to the Indian Ocean to sink Allied warships expected to be fleeing from Surabaya. This audacity resulted in jeopardizing the operation of at least the convoy which I escorted. The 41 transports were in two columns, 600 meters between ships, and 2,000 meters between columns. They zigzagged sluggishly at 10 knots. The formation was spearheaded by 4 minesweepers on a line of bearing with 3,000-meter intervals, followed at 3,000 meters by 3 destroyers, similarly spread. Then came cruiser Naka, the flagship, flanked by 2 small patrol ships. 1 destroyer to port and 1 to starboard guarded the middle section of the long transport columns. Another escort group, consisting of Destroyer Division 2 which included my Amatsukaze and 3 other destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's flagship Jintsu, was in position farther out on the port side. This group had taken part briefly in the Timor Island landing operation after Ambon, and we had joined the convoy at Makassar on February 25. 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro, followed haughtily behind the convoy at a distance of some 200 miles. The 20-mile-long convoy was quite a spectacle. An obvious laxity prevailed in the transports with their ill-trained crews. Many transports emitted huge clouds of black smoke from their funnels. Many used their radios in violation of no transmission orders, or failed to observe blackout rules at night. Enemy submarines could have had a field day against such easy targets. Most disturbing, however, was the dreadfully slow pace of the trailing heavy cruisers, the only ships of the force which packed a real punch, in case the enemy fleet chose to attack us. The weather was beautiful, sparkling sun by day, and bright moonlight silvered the sea every night. Even at night, trained eyes could span the length of the entire force. 5 Allied submarines had been observed by our reconnaissance planes, but none menaced our ships. To this day, I do not understand why enemy submarines failed to come out. On the morning of the 26th, the sea south of Borneo was calm. I awakened from a brief nap and pored over the latest information. Our reconnaissance planes and intelligence agents reported a formidable minefield all along the Surabaya coast, adding to the hazard of many sunken ships. The reports also said, the Allies are still flying bombers, including some B-17s recently arrived from Africa, and fighters at Malong and other small strips. The situation certainly did not warrant all our optimism. At 08 a PBY Catalina float plane suddenly slipped out of the clouds to the southeast and headed toward my ship. Enemy plane dead ahead. Open fire, I yelled. An anti-aircraft machine gun fired one burst as the PBY dropped a bomb a bit too early, which raised a large water pillar about 500 meters ahead. The plane swerved, gained speed and disappeared into the overcast. The whole action was so brief that we didn't even have time to get excited. This was most unusual. The more I thought about this awkward attack, the more puzzled I was. If the plane was on reconnaissance, as it must have been, it was foolish to have made its presence so obvious. It was still more ridiculous for the plane to drop just one bomb at a destroyer. A transport would have been a much more profitable target. In a way, it was good to know that the enemy was aware of our operation. A lookout called attention to a big white ship to port heading in our direction. Using large binoculars, I saw what appeared to be a hospital ship of about 4,000 tons. Its presence in this area was the second puzzle of the day. We hoisted flags ordering it to stand by for inspection, and sped toward the ship. Through binoculars I watched a small elderly man, apparently the ship's skipper, on deck hastily putting on a uniform. His hands were shaking and he appeared very nervous. As we closed, I read the name Optenote, and our ship register confirmed that it was a Dutch hospital ship. Lieutenant Guro Iwabuchi and 6 armed petty officers rowed over in a boat and boarded the ship. An hour later they returned to report some 15 doctors and nurses on board, in addition to the crew. I asked for instructions and Admiral Tanaka replied, "Even a hospital ship is objectionable in this area. Take it to the rear to anchor among our supply ships." I spent all morning chaperoning the hospital ship. After handing it over to the care of the supply squadron commander, I rushed back at 26 knots and rejoined the escort at 14:15. A few fighter planes from Balikpapan flew cover over the convoy. They came after the PBY had attacked us, and stayed overhead until about 19. By that time a cool breeze had sprung up. I lit a cigarette and asked the navigator the time of sunset. Lieutenant Toshio Koyama answered that the sun would set at 1948. My smoke was interrupted by the staccato sound of anti-aircraft guns. Seeing that cruiser Jintsu was firing, I ordered, "Battle stations, air attack." Looking up I saw 2 B-17 bombers coming out of the cloud deck some 4,000 meters high, and yelled, "Open fire." The 12.7 centimeter gun swung up to 75 degrees, but still could not bring the planes into range. The smaller guns were completely ineffective, but they fired as if their noise might scare the bombers. The B-17s, apparently from Java, dropped 6 500 lb bombs. 4 of them fell about 1,500 meters to starboard of Amatsukaze. 2 hit the water some 500 meters on destroyer Hitsukaze's port hand. Poor marksmanship. The bombers attacked our fighting ships, instead of troop-laden transports. That meant that the enemy wanted to knock out our fighting ships, so his fleet could tackle the whole convoy. This was alarming, and I felt braced for the challenge. The morning hours of the following day, February 27, were uneventful. Our crew continued with routine training. Then at 11:50, just when everyone was ready for lunch, 4 big bombs exploded without warning. Huge columns of water rose about 200 meters ahead of destroyer Yukikaze, cruising 3,000 meters to the right of my ship. The preceding day we had seen the bombers before they attacked. Today we were caught unawares, and belatedly I again discovered 2 B-17s flying just below the 4,000-meter cloud cover. The flying fortresses had certainly achieved surprise. It was only inept bombing that spoiled their chance. Their aiming again at the highly maneuverable warships puzzled me. Why did not they hit at the sluggish transports? One hit by a 500 lb bomb could easily have sunk a transport and disrupted the whole Japanese schedule. Today, years after the battle, I still believe that was a big mistake. Japan also made a serious error in launching this operation without sufficient air cover for the surface forces. But that mistake was offset by the ineffective and unwise tactics of the Allied planes. 10 minutes after the B-17 encounter, the convoy altered course 90 degrees for Surabaya. Until then we had been heading westward in a faint movement. We were already 60 miles north of Surabaya. Soon afterward a Japanese scout plane from Balikpapan flashed a report. 5 enemy cruisers and 6 destroyers, 63 miles 310 degrees from Surabaya at 12 hours. This force is heading on an 80-degree course at 12 knots. Nachi, 12,374 tons. One of the 2 heavy cruisers following this far to the rear, immediately catapulted its scout plane to maintain contact with the enemy fleet. The fleet was surprisingly near and apparently headed toward us. Was it coming to fight us? We waited uneasily for further scout plane reports.